Senior drill instructor Verk Torsion heard the impact before he saw it. A wet crack across the sparring mat, bone meeting reinforced cartilage, followed by 400 kilograms of Kethrasi Cadet hitting the floor hard enough to send a vibration through the observation platform. He looked down from the elevated gantry. Cadet Brawl, the largest trainee in 9th intake, was flat on his back with both primary arms locked against his chest in the instinctive Kethrasi guard posture. Standing over him, breathing through her nose with the kind of deliberate calm torsion associated with trained fighters and nobody else, was the human. Cadet Ren Ochoa, 17 Terran years, 49 kilograms soaking wet according to the intake biometrics. Torsion's dorsal plates, the bony ridges that ran from the back of his skull to the base of his spine, shifted half a degree. Among the Kethrasi, that micro-movement meant the same thing a raised eyebrow meant among humans, though Torsion had never raised an eyebrow in his life and had no intention of starting. It meant that should not have happened. He tapped the scoring console embedded in the gantry railing. The sparring session was part of the morning drill rotation, one of 12 combat contact bouts scheduled before the midday feed. Cadet Ochoa had been matched against Brawl because the automated bracket system paired by rank, not mass, and both cadets sat in the unranked pool reserved for new intakes who hadn't earned their first mark. Brawl outweighed her by a factor of 8. His Kethrasi skeletal density was classified as structural grade. His species trained in physical combat from larval stage, and the dorsal horn that curved from his forehead had been filed to regulation bluntness twice since arriving at the Kethrasi Military Institute, because it kept growing back sharp. Ochoa had used his weight against him. The move was simple in principle. She'd sidestepped his charge, caught the wrist of his leading arm in both hands, redirected his momentum into a rotational fall, and locked his elbow at the one angle that Kethrasi joints could not resist without tearing ligament. Brawl had gone down rather than lose the use of his arm. It had taken 4 seconds. Torsion noted the time on his console, saved the bout record, and said nothing. He had 37 cadets in 9th intake. 36 of them had drawn his attention in the expected ways: biological advantages, species-specific combat styles, raw aggression that needed channeling. The human had drawn his attention by not drawing it. She moved through drills like water finding a channel. No excess, no display. She did what was required, did it correctly, and then stood still while everyone else recovered. He didn't like it. Not because it was wrong, because it was unreadable. Torsion had been a drill instructor at the Kethrasi Military Institute for 19 years, and in that time he had processed over 800 cadets from 41 species. He could read the body language of a vrelid in thermal distress. He could identify a Kalori's spatial mapping reflex by the way her eyes tracked a thrown object. He could tell when a Pelori was about to collapse from pressure sickness by a color shift in the translucent webbing between his fingers. He could not read the human. Her resting heart rate displayed on his biometric feed was 62 beats per minute. After throwing Brawl, it had risen to 74. It was already back to 66. Among Kethrasi, whose twin hearts operated in counter-rhythm, and whose resting cardiac output was nearly double that of a human, that kind of recovery was unremarkable. Among a species the conquered physiological database classified as moderate endurance, limited strength, no significant biological advantages, it was anomalous. He closed the sparring bracket and activated the next rotation. The morning drill continued. Ochoa won her second bout against a Kethrasi cadet named Dren by exploiting the 3-jointed arm's blind spot at full extension. Dren had telegraphed a sweeping overhead strike, the kind that worked against most opponents because the reach was nearly 2 meters. Ochoa stepped inside the arc before the blow reached full extension, trapped the middle joint with both hands, and redirected the momentum into a controlled lateral fall. She'd modified the technique she'd used on Brawl, adjusting the angle for the different limb architecture. That modification took knowledge of anatomy not in the intake curriculum. She lost her third bout to a pelori who was simply faster than she was, taking a clean strike to the sternum that dropped her to one knee. The pelori was just faster, and there was nothing to exploit. Ochoa took the hit cleanly, got back up in 2 seconds, touched the spot where the strike had landed, and gave the pelori a small nod that Torsion recognized as genuine acknowledgement. She won her fourth bout against a second Gorathi by targeting the ankle joint, the one structural weakness in the Gorathi lower limb that most cadets never discovered until advanced anatomy class in the third training cycle. She had found it in her first week. He noted that too. She didn't sulk about losses. She noted them and moved on. In his experience, that was the mark of someone who had lost enough times that the sting had worn smooth. After morning drill, Torsion descended from the gantry and walked the length of the sparring hall. The cadets were dispersing toward the hygiene block. Ochoa was the last to leave the mat, rolling her right wrist in a small circle that suggested the throw on Brull had cost her something she wasn't showing. Cadet Ochoa. She stopped and turned. Her face was neutral, not blank, not hostile, not deferential, neutral, as if the words that came next could be anything from a commendation to a reprimand and she'd receive either the same way. Instructor Torsion. Your throw on Cadet Brull, where did you learn that technique? My father ran a judo school in Valparaiso. I started when I was 4. Judo? Torsion's universal translator handled the word, but the concept required context. He queried his datapad. The results were sparse, a Terran grappling discipline emphasizing leverage, momentum redirection, and joint manipulation. Combat art, pre-spaceflight origin, widely practiced among humans for recreational and competitive purposes. Recreational. His dorsal plates shifted again. The Gorathi are not a species accustomed to being redirected. Nothing personal, he was the one in front of me. She said it without irony, without challenge, as a statement of mechanical fact. Torsion studied her for 3 seconds longer than necessary, then dismissed her with a curt nod. He returned to his quarters and pulled up the intake file on Cadet Ochoa Ren, born in Valparaiso, Chile, Earth, second of 4 children. Father, civilian martial arts instructor. Mother, structural engineer. No military family background. No prior Concord training. Recruited through the Terran integration pathway, a program the Concord had established 2 years ago when the Terran accession treaty required a minimum of 12 human cadets to be admitted to Concord military academies per cycle. Ochoa was one of 8 accepted to the Kethrasi Military Institute specifically, chosen from a pool of 1,400 applicants. Her entrance scores were unremarkable. Physical testing placed her in the 43rd percentile relative to the full cadet body. Cognitive assessment was higher, 71st percentile, but not exceptional by the standards of species with larger neural architectures. Her psychological profile flagged one item. She had tested unusually high on adaptive stress response, defined as the ability to modulate performance under escalating pressure without a corresponding spike in cortisol or equivalent stress markers. The evaluator had added a note. Subject demonstrates flat affect under pressure consistent with extensive prior conditioning or temperamental predisposition. Recommend monitoring. Torsion read the note twice. He cross-referenced the file against the intake records of the other 7 human cadets accepted to the Institute. 3 had been reassigned to logistical support tracks before their first drill week ended. 2 had washed out entirely, 1 for failure to meet minimum physical thresholds, 1 for psychological incompatibility with the Kethrasi command hierarchy. The remaining 2 were performing adequately, neither distinguishing themselves nor struggling, invisible in the mid-range of their respective cohorts. Ochoa was none of those things. She wasn't adequate. She wasn't invisible. She was something Torsion didn't have a category for, and he had a category for everything. He pulled up the intake performance projections. The model predicted she would wash out within 16 days. It assigned her a 12% probability of finishing in the top half of her cohort. He didn't believe them. He closed the projection file and opened the training calendar for the next 14 days. Tomorrow was the sequence. The sequence was the Kethrasi Military Institute's signature qualifying drill. Every incoming intake ran it within their first 10 days. It was not a test in the academic sense. There were no scores, no rankings, no pass-fail thresholds. The sequence was a diagnostic tool. It told the instructors what each cadet could tolerate, where their biological architecture failed, and how they responded to failure. The drill was structured as a cascading physical-cognitive gauntlet. 7 stages, each layered on top of the last, each adding one new stressor. Stage 1 was a simple endurance run at standard gravity. Stage 2 added gravitational load. Stage 3 introduced temperature variance while maintaining the elevated gravity. Stage 4 layered in atmospheric pressure changes. Stage 5 added cognitive tasks, pattern recognition and tactical puzzles projected onto the visor while the body was already under compound stress. Stage 6 introduced sensory disruption, strobe lighting, white noise, vibrational interference through the floor. Stage 7 combined everything and added an unpredictable combat element. A sparring drone that engaged the cadet at random intervals while all other stressors remained active. The drill was built to collapse every cadet in sequence. That was the point. Each species hit a wall at a predictable stage, determined by their biological architecture. Kethrasi typically collapsed at stage 4, when temperature variance cracked their thermoregulation. Cadet dropped at stage 3, gravity crushing their hollow-boned frames. Vrelid made it to stage 5 but failed the cognitive layer, their neural processing unable to split between body management and abstract problem-solving simultaneously. Kethrasi lasted deep into stage 6 but broke at stage 7, their rigid combat programming unable to adapt to the drone's randomized attack patterns. In 19 years, Torsion had never seen a cadet complete all 7 stages. He had seen 6 cadets reach stage 7. 2 had lasted longer than 40 seconds before the drone triggered a biometric safety pull. The longest survivor of stage 7 was a Drathiki named Yin, who had lasted 2 minutes and 11 seconds 7 years ago. Yin was now a fleet commander. Torsion still remembered the way Yin's compound eyes had gone flat and dark in the final seconds, the Drathiki equivalent of shutting down non-essential cognitive function to pour everything into survival. Torsion reviewed the sequence parameters for 9th intake and made no adjustments. The drill ran the same for everyone. That was the rule. No species-specific calibration. No accommodation for body mass, limb count, or thermal tolerance. The sequence treated every cadet as a generic organism and measured what happened when that organism was systematically overloaded. He set his alarm for 4:30 and went to sleep. The staging bay at 500 was cold. Torsion kept it that way deliberately. Cold sharpened attention and dampened bravado. 37 cadets assembled in 4 rows, their breath visible in the air. The Kethrasi were the most visibly uncomfortable. Their stone-dense musculature conducted cold efficiently, and Brull's dorsal horn had a thin frost line forming along its filed edge. Ochoa stood in the 2nd row, 3rd from the left. She was wearing the standard-issue compression suit, which fit her poorly in the shoulders and was too long in the torso. She had cinched the waist strap to compensate. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot. Her face was the same neutral mask she wore in sparring. Torsion addressed them from the gantry. His voice carried without amplification. Kethrasi vocal cords produced sound at frequencies that traveled efficiently through cold, dense air, an evolutionary holdover from a homeworld where most communication happened during the long frozen season. 9th intake, The sequence begins in 30 minutes. You have been briefed on the structure. I will not repeat it. What I will tell you is this: every one of you will fail today. The sequence is not built for completion. It is built to find the exact point where your body and your mind stop cooperating. That point is not a weakness. It is information. I need that information to train you. Your job is to give it to me honestly, by running until you cannot run, thinking until you cannot think, and fighting until you cannot fight. He paused. His dorsal plates were fully raised, the Kethrasi display posture that meant absolute authority. Any cadet who quits before their body forces the safety pull will be noted. Any cadet who performs beyond their projected collapse point will also be noted. Both are data. Neither is judgment. Do you understand? 37 voices answered in rough unison. Ochoa's voice was lost in the chorus. Torsion didn't need to hear it specifically. He'd already seen the answer in her posture. She understood. The sequence chamber was a cylindrical space 50 meters in diameter and 20 meters tall, ringed with environmental control nodes that could manipulate gravity, temperature, atmosphere, light, sound, and particulate density independently. The floor was a composite lattice embedded with motion sensors, biometric readers, and the magnetic rails that guided the stage 7 sparring drones. Observation galleries surrounded the upper ring, separated from the chamber by reinforced transparent barriers that could withstand a Gorathi thrown at full force. Torsion took his position in the primary observation station. His console displayed the biometric feeds for all 37 cadets, arranged in a grid that color-coded by species. He could see heart rates, core temperatures, cortisol analogs, neural coherence scores, and muscular output metrics in real time. The system would trigger automatic safety pulls when any biometric crossed the species-specific danger threshold. Stage 1 activated at 5:30. The cadets ran. The track was a 300-meter oval, standard gravity ambient temperature. Baseline. Torsion watched the biometric feed stabilize as each cadet found their rhythm. The pylori surged to the front immediately, their whip-thin musculature optimized for explosive speed, lapping the Gorathi cadets within the first 4 minutes. The Vrelid ran in pairs, their mandibles clicking in synchronized rhythms that functioned as a pacing mechanism, like runners breathing together. Ochoa's heart rate climbed to 128 and held. Her stride was short but efficient. She didn't try to match the pylori's blistering opening pace or the Gorathi's heavy, ground-eating strides. She ran her own race. Torsion noticed that she'd settled into a position in the middle third of the pack, drafting behind a cluster of Kethrasi cadets whose tall frames broke the air resistance for her. It could have been coincidence. It could have been tactical. With this human, he found he couldn't tell. 12 minutes into Stage 1, the floor indicators lit amber. Stage 2 was loading. Gravity increased to 1.3 standard. The effect was immediate and visible. The Kailori cadets, 3 of them in this intake, began to labor. Their hollow bones were optimized for their homeworld's 0.7 standard gravity. At 1.3, every step cost them nearly double. One Kailori, a tall female named Tessith, dropped her pace by 30% in the first 60 seconds of Stage 2. Ochoa's pace dropped by 8%. She adjusted her stride, shortening it further, landing more on the balls of her feet. Her form shifted subtly, and Torsion recognized the adaptation. She was switching from a distance-running gait to something closer to a loaded march, the kind of movement pattern that prioritized energy conservation over speed. He'd seen that adaptation before, in Vrelid cadets from high-gravity colony worlds. He had never seen it in a human. Stage 3 added temperature variance. The chamber's thermal nodes began cycling between -15 and +40 in alternating 60-second waves. The Gorathi slowed immediately, their thermoregulation struggling with the rapid oscillation. Brull's biometric feed showed his core temperature swinging by nearly 2 degrees per cycle, well within safety limits but deeply uncomfortable. Ochoa's core temperature varied by 0.4 degrees. Her body was sweating in the hot phases, which the chamber's sensors flagged with the same baffled notation Torsion had seen in reports from other academies that had processed human cadets: anomalous fluid excretion from dermal surface. He'd read the xenobiology brief. He understood the mechanism. He still found it viscerally unsettling to watch a sentient being leak water from their skin as a cooling strategy. But it worked. Her biometrics stayed green. The first safety pull came at 14 minutes into Stage 3. Tessith, the K-Lori, collapsed when the gravity and the cold phase combined to lock her knee joints. The chamber extracted her gently. 2 more K-Lori followed within 3 minutes. By the end of Stage 3, 4 cadets were out. Stage 4. Atmospheric pressure climbed to 2.1 standard. The air thickened. Breathing became deliberate work. Torsion watched the Vrelid cadets compensate by opening their secondary breathing vents, the mandible-adjacent slits that allowed their species to process denser atmospheres. The Kethrasi switched to deep, rhythmic inhalation through their vertical nostrils, each breath lasting 4 seconds. Ochoa breathed through her nose. Short, measured pulls. Her oxygen saturation dropped from 98 to 93% and held. The human respiratory system was not designed for high-pressure atmospheres, but it was designed for altitude, for thin air, for the variable oxygen environments of a world where the atmosphere changed with elevation. What Torsion was seeing was the inverse application of that architecture. A system built to extract oxygen from thin air could, with effort, tolerate thick air without choking. She didn't look comfortable. Her jaw was clenched. A vein in her neck stood visible, but she kept moving. 2 Vrelid collapsed in Stage 4 when the pressure and temperature swings combined to overload their neural pathways. 1 Gorathi went down when his core temperature swung past the safety threshold. A Kethrasi cadet dropped at the 17-minute mark, his 3-jointed arms seizing mid-stride. As the chamber pulled him, Torsion noticed Ochoa glance sideways at the extraction point, register the Kethrasi's condition, and return her attention forward in under a second. No alarm, no sympathy, just clinical acknowledgement. By the end of Stage 4, 11 cadets were out. Torsion checked his projections. 26 remained. The human was one of them. According to the Concord Physiological Database's performance model, she should have collapsed in Stage 3. The database's confidence interval was 87%. Torsion pulled up the model's prediction timeline and watched the confidence bar for the human's projected collapse point sit stubbornly in the past, grayed out, expired. The model was still running. The human was still running. The model didn't know what to do about that. He looked at Ochoa's biometric feed. Her heart rate was at 156, elevated but controlled. Her neural coherence score, the measure of how well her cognitive function was tracking under physical stress, was at 0.81. Most cadets at this stage were below 0.7. Stage 5 activated, the cognitive layer. Holographic symbols appeared in each cadet's visor. Pattern sequences that required identification and classification, while the body continued to run, breathe, and thermoregulate under compound stress. The patterns were drawn from a library of 7,000 tactical symbols used across 17 conquered species. Cadets had been given the symbol lexicon during intake orientation. Most had memorized a fraction of it. Torsion watched the neural coherence scores drop across the board as cadets tried to split their attention. The Vrelid pair that remained, Sarek among them, failed within 4 minutes. Their species processed visual pattern data through the same neural cluster that managed motor coordination. Asking them to do both simultaneously under physical stress was like asking a Gorathi to fly. The architecture didn't support it. Ochoa's neural coherence dropped to 0.74, then it stabilized. She was answering the pattern prompts at a rate of 1 every 9 seconds, not fast, but accurate. Her error rate after the first 2 minutes was 4%. The next closest cadet, a pelori with a divided brain structure that allowed genuine parallel processing, had an error rate of 2%. A Drathiki with compound visual processors was at 3%, but his six-limbed coordination was beginning to stutter, the cognitive load pulling resources from his motor system in a way that made his gait increasingly erratic. But the pelori's body was failing. His pressure-adapted physiology was holding against the atmosphere, but the gravity was crushing him. His muscular output was down 40%. His running pace had become a stagger. Ochoa's pace was a steady walk, not fast, not elegant. She walked like someone carrying a load uphill, each step placed with intention, each breath drawn with effort. But she walked and she answered, and her biometrics stayed below the safety threshold. By the end of Stage 5, 20 cadets were out. 17 remained. Ochoa was one of them. Torsion felt his dorsal plates shift again, not the half degree of mild surprise, a full degree. Among Kethrasi, that was the equivalent of saying the word impossible out loud. He didn't say it. He pulled up the Stage 6 parameters and confirmed they were calibrated correctly. Stage 6, sensory disruption. The lights in the chamber began strobing at frequencies designed to disrupt visual processing across the broadest possible species range. White noise flooded the audio channels, layered with subharmonic vibrations that traveled through the floor and into the skeletal structure of every cadet still standing. The pattern prompts in the visor continued, now flickering at irregular intervals, their display rhythm deliberately misaligned with the strobe. This was where most cadets broke, not from the physical stress, which had been building for 35 minutes, but from the sensory overload. The body could endure. The mind, trying to process meaningful signal through a wall of noise, hit a ceiling. 5 cadets collapsed in the first 90 seconds of Stage 6, 3 more in the next 2 minutes. By the 4-minute mark, only 9 cadets remained, then 8, then 7. A Drathiki whose compound eyes gave him some resistance to the strobe effect held until the 5-minute mark before his motor coordination disintegrated and the safety pull activated. 6 cadets, Ochoa was one of them. Torsion studied her biometric feed with an attention he reserved for exceptional cases. Her heart rate was at 171. Her cortisol was elevated but not spiked. Her neural coherence had dropped to 0.62, the lowest it had been, but it was holding there. Not climbing, not falling, holding. She was answering the pattern prompts at 1 every 14 seconds now. Slower, but still accurate. Her error rate had climbed to 9%, but 9% under compound Stage 6 stress was a number that belonged to cadets with neural architectures 3 times more complex than hers. He watched her face on the close-up camera. Her eyes were narrowed against the strobe, focused on a middle distance that suggested she wasn't trying to see everything but was instead filtering, choosing what to process and discarding the rest. Her jaw was still clenched. The vein in her neck was more prominent. Sweat ran from her hairline and dripped from her jaw in a steady rhythm. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't fighting the disruption. She was coexisting with it, treating the noise and the light and the vibration as weather, something to endure, not something to defeat. At the 8-minute mark of Stage 6, another cadet dropped, then another, 4 remained. Ochoa, a Gorathi whose raw mass had carried him through on sheer physical inertia. A Kethrasi cadet named Drell whose species had designed the drill, and therefore had the home field advantage of familiarity. And a pelori named Kes who was running on what Torsion recognized as pure stubbornness, his body well past its optimal range. At 9 minutes Kes collapsed, 3. The chamber's AI queried Torsion's station. Standard protocol before Stage 7 activation. Confirm that remaining cadets' biometrics are within parameters for combat engagement. Torsion checked. The Gorathi was flagged amber on thermoregulation but green on everything else. Drell was green across the board. Ochoa was green on cardiac function, amber on cortisol, green on neural coherence, and flagged with an annotation he'd never seen before: thermoregulatory mechanism active and compensating. The AI wanted confirmation that the human sweating wasn't a medical event. He confirmed the sweating was normal for a human. Stage 7 activated. The sparring drones deployed from the floor. 3 drones, 1 per remaining cadet, hovering at chest height on magnetic rails, each armed with padded contact surfaces that delivered a measured kinetic pulse on impact. Not enough to injure, enough to hurt. The drones operated on a randomized attack pattern seeded by the chamber AI, recalibrating every 8 seconds based on the cadet's position, velocity, and defensive responses. The Gorathi took the first drone strike on his shoulder and barely registered it. His mass absorbed the kinetic pulse the way a mountain absorbs rain. He kept moving, kept answering patterns, kept enduring the strobe and the noise and the gravity and the pressure. His biometrics held. Torsion respected that. The Gorathi species was a blunt instrument, but blunt instruments had their place. Drell, the Kethrasi cadet, responded to the drone with trained efficiency. His species combat programming, drilled since adolescence, activated the moment the first contact pulse hit his chest. He blocked, sidestepped, and counterattacked in the prescribed Kethrasi defensive sequence. The drone adapted. Drell adapted to the adaptation. It was a clean, technical exchange that Torsion appreciated as a craftsman appreciated another craftsman's work. Ochoa did something different. The first drone strike came at her left shoulder. She didn't block it. She absorbed it, twisting at the waist to distribute the kinetic pulse across her torso instead of taking it on the joint. The motion looked like failure. It looked like she'd been hit and moved with it because she couldn't stop it. Torsion leaned forward. The drone recalibrated. Its next attack came from the right, faster, aimed at her ribs. Ochoa stepped into it, not away. Into. She closed the distance between herself and the drone, reducing its kinetic window, and caught the padded contact surface with her open palm. The drone's magnetic rail fought her grip for 1.2 seconds. Then she redirected it downward, using the same leverage principle she'd applied to brawl on the sparring mat. The drone hit the floor. Its rail re-engaged immediately and it rose again, but the recalibration pause cost it 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Ochoa answered 2 pattern prompts, corrected her breathing rhythm, and repositioned to the center of the track. Torsion's dorsal plates went flat, full flat. Among Kethrasi, that was not surprise, that was recognition. She wasn't fighting the drone the way the combat manuals taught. She wasn't defending against it in any recognized species-specific style. She was treating the drone the same way she treated the gravity, the temperature, the pressure, the noise, and the strobe. As another variable, another layer of weather, something to absorb, redirect, and move through. The Gorathi lasted 2 minutes and 40 seconds into Stage 7 before a combined heat spike and drone strike triggered his safety pull. He went down roaring, his dorsal horn scraping the floor. 2 remained. Drell and Ochoa. Drell was performing exactly as Torsion expected. The Kethrasi cadet was in the 87th percentile of his species' projected performance model. He was blocking the drone cleanly, answering patterns at a steady 6% error rate and maintaining neural coherence at 0.58. Strong, reliable, well within the template. Ochoa's neural coherence was at 0.54, lower than Drell's. Her pattern prompt rate had slowed to 1 every 18 seconds. Her error rate had climbed to 12%. Her heart rate was 178. By the numbers, she was performing worse than the Kethrasi cadet. But she was still standing, and she was still adapting. At the 3-minute mark of Stage 7, the drones recalibrated simultaneously. Both switched to a high-frequency attack pattern, 4 contact attempts in 8 seconds, designed to overwhelm defensive processing. Drell shifted into the Kethrasi rapid response mode, a hardwired combat subroutine that sacrificed higher cognition for reflexive defense. His pattern prompt accuracy crashed to 0. His drone blocks became instinctive, automatic, correct. He survived the surge. Ochoa didn't have a hardwired rapid response mode. Humans didn't have combat subroutines. What this particular human had, was something Torsion had seen in the xenopsychology reports but never witnessed in real time: adaptive load management. Instead of shutting down higher cognition to free resources for combat, she compressed. She stopped answering pattern prompts entirely for 6 seconds, used those 6 seconds to establish the drone's new attack rhythm, then resumed answering prompts in the gaps between strikes. Her accuracy dropped to 19%. Her timing was ragged, but she was doing both. No species in the Concord's physiological database was supposed to be able to do both under Stage 7 conditions. The drill was designed so that by Stage 7, every species had to choose: fight the drone or answer the prompts. The biological ceiling prevented both. Humans apparently didn't have the same ceiling. They had a floor that kept dropping. At 4 minutes and 31 seconds into Stage 7, Drell's biometrics crossed the safety threshold. Not a single metric but an aggregate, the cumulative load across 6 stages of compound stress, finally exceeding his body's capacity to compensate. The chamber pulled him cleanly. He was unconscious before he hit the medical platform. Ochoa was alone in the chamber. Torsion stood up from his console. In 19 years, he had never stood up during a sequence. He watched from the observation gallery with his dorsal plates flat against his spine, and his twin hearts beating in the deep, slow counter-rhythm that Kethrasi physiology reserved for moments of absolute focus. The drone attacked. Ochoa moved with it, around it, through its patterns. She wasn't fast. She wasn't graceful. She was grinding, every step a negotiation with gravity and pressure and air that fought her lungs. Sweat poured from her. Her compression suit was dark with it. Her eyes, visible on the close-up camera, were narrowed to slits, and the expression behind them was one Torsion had seen on the faces of old soldiers but never on a 17-year-old in her first qualifying drill. It was the expression of someone who had decided at some point before the drill began that she would not stop until her body stopped for her. Not defiance, not bravery, something quieter, something that lived in the marrow. She answered 3 more pattern prompts. 2 were correct. The drone struck her in the ribs. She staggered, caught herself, kept walking. At 5 minutes and 9 seconds, her heart rate hit 184. The chamber AI queried Torsion station. Safety threshold advisory. The human's cardiac output was approaching the upper limit of the species' documented safe range. Torsion studied the feed. Her rhythm was elevated but stable. No arrhythmia, no erratic output. The heart was working at capacity, but it was working correctly. He cleared the advisory. Continue. At 6 minutes and 2 seconds, her neural coherence dropped to 0.41. Below the threshold, the system used for cognitive function compromised status. The pattern prompts in her visor were still cycling. She hadn't answered one in 38 seconds. But she was still moving, still tracking the drone, still absorbing its strikes and redirecting when she could. Her body was operating on something that Torsion's instruments couldn't quantify. Not biology, not chemistry, something in the gap between what the numbers said she could do and what she was doing. At 6 minutes and 44 seconds, her left knee buckled. She caught herself on her hands. The drone circled, recalibrated, struck at her exposed back. She rolled with it, came up on one knee and faced the drone from a half-crouch. Her breathing was ragged. Her arms were shaking. On the close-up camera, her lips were moving, but the white noise made it impossible to hear what she was saying, if she was saying anything at all. Torsion realized, with a sensation he could only describe as a deep structural shift in his understanding of what he was watching, that she was counting. Her lips were forming numbers. She was counting the seconds, not to know when it would end. There was no end point, no timer. The sequence ran until the body gave out. She was counting because counting was a task, and as long as she had a task, she had something to do besides stop. At 7 minutes and 18 seconds, her heart rate hit 191. The chamber AI didn't query this time. It triggered the automated safety pull. The force field caught her mid-stride. She was still moving forward when it locked around her and lifted her toward the medical platform. Her eyes were open. Her fists were closed. She was still counting. The chamber shut down. The strobe died. The noise cut. The gravity bled back to standard. The temperature normalized. The drone retracted into the floor. Silence filled the observation gallery. The other instructors, 8 of them arranged along the upper tier, had stopped looking at their individual console feeds. They were looking at Torsion, waiting. Instructor Velis, the junior Kailari, was the first to speak. Her amber eyes blinked laterally in the slow double sweep. That meant her model of reality had just failed a consistency check. The projected collapse point for a Terran was stage 3. The longest any cadet has survived stage 7 was 2 minutes and 11 seconds. She paused. The human lasted 7 minutes and 18 seconds. That is not possible. And yet, Torsion said without looking up. The gallery remained quiet after that. Torsion's console displayed the results in the clean, standardized format the Institute used for all sequence diagnostics. Cadet Ochoa ran, species, Terran, stages completed, 6 full plus stage 7 survival. Stage 7 duration, 7 minutes 18 seconds. Overall compound stress exposure, 49 minutes 31 seconds. Extraction trigger, automated cardiac threshold. He read the numbers. Then he opened the Institute's historical record and searched for the longest stage 7 survival time in the sequence's 31-year operational history. The record was stored in a subfile that had only been accessed 14 times since the sequence's inception, because only 14 cadets had ever reached stage 7 at all. Yen Drathiki, 7 years ago, 2 minutes 11 seconds. Ochoa had tripled it. Torsion closed the historical record. He sat back in his chair. His dorsal plates were motionless, flat against his spine in a posture that other Kethrasi would read as either absolute calm or absolute shock, and would not be able to tell the difference. His twin hearts were still beating in the deep counterrhythm of absolute focus, and he could not make them stop. The medical team's report arrived on his console within the hour. Cadet Ochoa, mild cardiac strain, resolved with standard vasodilator treatment. Bilateral patellar tendon inflammation, treated with localized regenerative compression. 2 hairline stress fractures in the left tibia, consistent with sustained locomotion under elevated gravitational load, stabilized with osteobonding gel. Cortisol levels elevated but returning to baseline. Core temperature 1.2 degrees above species norm, attributed to thermoregulatory fluid loss. Total fluid excretion during the sequence, 2.4 liters. Cognitive function fully restored within 40 minutes of extraction. The cadet had declined the recommended 2-hour rest period and was currently in the hygiene block. 2 hairline stress fractures. Torsion reread that line. She had been running on fractures for the last 3 stages. The fractures had likely originated in stage 3, when the gravity increase began compounding with the repetitive impact of locomotion. She had continued through stages 4, 5, 6, and 7 with bones that were actively breaking under load, and her biometric feed had not flagged it because the pain indicators for a human stress fracture were below the threshold the system used for species with denser skeletal structures. The system hadn't known she was hurt. She hadn't told it. Torsion read the medical report a second time, then pulled up the xenobiology file on Terran physiology. He had read it before, during intake processing. He read it again now with different eyes. Humans were persistence predators. Their evolutionary niche was not strength, speed, armor, venom, or sensory acuity. It was the ability to keep going after everything else had stopped. Their cardiovascular system was optimized for sustained output over extreme durations. Their thermoregulation, the sweating that every other species found bizarre, allowed them to operate at high metabolic rates without overheating. Their cognitive architecture, while not the fastest or most parallel, was uniquely capable of adaptive compression under load, redistributing processing resources on the fly rather than hitting a fixed wall. The file contained a note, appended by a conquered physiologist whose name Torsion didn't recognize. Terran endurance capacity is theoretically unbounded within survivable environmental parameters. Species does not possess a documented performance ceiling in the traditional sense. Instead, performance degrades along a gradient with no discrete failure point. The organism continues to function at progressively reduced capacity until critical organ failure occurs. No discrete failure point. The organism continues to function. Torsion closed the file. He understood now why the sequence had not been able to collapse the human in sequence. The drill was designed around the assumption that every species had a wall, a stage where biology said stop. Humans didn't have a wall. They had a slope. And this particular human had decided, at some point that Torsion could not identify, that slopes were for walking on, not stopping at. He opened his training planner for the next 12 weeks. The next morning, Torsion arrived at the sparring hall before any cadet. He stood on the gantry, console active, biometric feeds loading. The cadets filed in for morning drill at 500. Ochoa entered with the second group. She was walking with a slight hitch in her left knee, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. She took her position on the mat and waited. Torsion descended from the gantry. He never descended before a drill. The cadets noticed. 37 sets of eyes tracked him as he walked across the sparring floor. He stopped in front of Ochoa. She looked up at him, same neutral expression, same stillness, but something in her eyes that hadn't been there before the sequence, not fear, not pride, not even recognition of what she'd done. Just steadiness. The look of someone who had been to the bottom of what she had and found that there was still something left. Torsion's dorsal plates rose to their full display height. In Kethrasi culture, a drill instructor raising full dorsal display before a subordinate meant one of two things: a formal challenge or a formal acknowledgement. The distinction was in the angle of the head. Torsion inclined his. Acknowledgement. Cadet Ochoa, you will report to advanced conditioning at 600 tomorrow. You are being moved from the general intake rotation to the selective stress training program. She didn't react. Not a smile, not a flinch, not a widening of the eyes. Her response was 3 words, delivered in the same flat tone she'd used to explain the throw on Brull. Understood, Instructor Torsion. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the gantry. Halfway across the floor he stopped. He didn't turn around. The sequence record for Stage 7 was 2 minutes and 11 seconds. It was held by a Drathiki named Yen, who is now a fleet commander. It had stood for 7 years. He paused. The sparring hall was silent, 37 cadets listening. It stood for 7 years. As of yesterday, it no longer stands. He resumed walking. Behind him, the silence held for 3 more seconds. Then Brull, the Gorathi she had thrown on the first day, brought both of his primary fists together in the Gorathi salute, a sound like 2 boulders meeting. The impact echoed off the sparring hall walls and came back, and by the time it returned, Sarek's mandibles were clicking in a rapid pattern that Torsion recognized from other intakes as Vrelid respect. the clicking rhythm that their species reserved for acknowledging an opponent who had earned the right to be called dangerous. Drell, the Kethrasi cadet who had been the last to fall before Ochoa, raised his dorsal plates to half display, the Kethrasi gesture of peer acknowledgement between equals. It was a gesture Drell would not have used toward a non-Kethrasi 2 days ago. The sequence had changed the taxonomy. Tessith, the Kalori who had dropped in stage 3, inclined her head in the slow lateral sweep her species used to honor endurance they could not match. 2 Kethrani cadets brought their 3-jointed arms to vertical, palms forward, the gesture that translated roughly as "I have no advantage over you." The sound spread, species-specific salutes and gestures of recognition, some loud, some silent, some visible only to those who knew what to look for. Not applause, not celebration. Recognition from beings who understood what it meant to be broken by a drill, and who had watched someone refuse to break. Ochoa stood in the middle of it with her weight on her right knee and her hands at her sides, and her face showing nothing that torsion could read from the gantry. If the recognition moved her, she gave no sign. If it didn't, that was its own kind of answer. He sat down at his console. He opened the species performance database, the same one that had predicted the human would collapse in stage 3 with 87% confidence. He found the entry for Homo sapiens, found the performance projection model, found the note that read, "Moderate endurance, limited strength, no significant biological advantages." He deleted it. In its place, he wrote, "Performance projection model unreliable. Recommend direct observation only. Standard biological baselines do not apply to this species under compound stress conditions. Discard all ceiling assumptions." He saved the entry and closed the file. On the sparring floor below, morning drill began. The cadets moved to their positions. Ochoa was matched against a Pelori in the first bout. She stepped onto the mat with the same economy she'd shown on the first day, and settled into her stance, weight balanced, hands open, eyes steady. The Pelori was faster than she was. He would probably win this bout. That was fine. She would note the loss, adjust, and come back for the next one. That was what she did. That was what humans did. They came back. Torsion watched from the gantry and did not look away. 19 years of processing cadets, 800 bodies through the intake system, 41 species with their documented walls and their predictable collapse points. He had built his career on the principle that biology was destiny, that every organism had a ceiling, and that the purpose of training was to get a cadet as close to that ceiling as possible. The sequence was the instrument of that principle. It found ceilings. That was what it did. And now this. A 17-year-old from a coastal city on a backwater world, 49 kilograms. 2 hairline fractures in her left tibia that she hadn't mentioned to anyone. No biological advantages. No combat subroutines. No thermal regulation implants. No parallel processing neural architecture. Just a slope that went all the way down, and a pair of feet that kept walking on it. He opened his private log, the one he kept outside the official system, and wrote a single entry. 9th intake, day 8. The human ran the sequence to stage 7, 7 minutes 18 seconds, longest sustained performance in the drill's history by a factor of 3. I have trained 800 cadets. I have never been unable to predict a collapse point. I was unable to predict hers, not because my data was wrong. Because the data does not apply, this species does not have a ceiling. They have a decision. She made hers before she walked into the chamber. I do not yet understand what makes a species capable of that. I intend to find out. He closed the log and turned his full attention to the sparring floor, where Cadet Ochoa had just sidestepped the Pelori's opening strike and settled into the patient, efficient rhythm of someone who had a very long time to learn everything the galaxy wanted to teach her. The Pelori won, as predicted, Clean strike to the solar plexus that Ochoa couldn't evade because the pylori's reaction time operated on a fundamentally shorter loop than hers. She took it standing, folded at the waist for 2 seconds, straightened and walked off the mat. No limp this time. She'd shifted her weight distribution to mask the hitch in her left knee, and if Torsion hadn't been watching for it specifically, he would have missed the micro-adjustment in her stride. She was learning to hide damage. That was either a survival skill or a liability, depending on the circumstances. He filed it under both. By midday, the sequence results had propagated through the Institute's internal data network. Torsion had not published them. He didn't need to. The Institute ran on information the same way a starship ran on fuel, and 37 cadets who had witnessed the drill firsthand were better broadcasters than any official report. By the time the evening feed cycle began, every instructor and senior cadet in the facility knew that a human had tripled the Stage 7 record. Most of them didn't believe it. Several queried Torsion's data directly. He confirmed the numbers without commentary and let them draw their own conclusions. Senior Instructor Kaelis, the Gorathi who ran the Advanced Combat Program, was the first to contact him formally. His message was 3 lines. I have reviewed the sequence data for Cadet Ochoa. I would like to observe her next sparring session. Also, what is judo? Torsion sent him the file. The second message came from Subcommander Rethais, the Institute's administrative head. She was Kethrasi, older than Torsion by 11 years, and her dorsal plates had been surgically reinforced after a structural injury during the border campaign. Her message was longer but no less direct. The sequence diagnostics for your 9th intake contain an anomaly that has triggered a review flag in the Concord Training Standards database. Specifically, the Stage 7 duration for Cadet Ochoa exceeds the maximum value the reporting system was designed to accept. The field caps at 5 minutes. Please confirm whether the recorded duration of 7 minutes 18 seconds is a data entry error. Torsion responded, "It is not an error. Recommend updating the field cap." The third message arrived at 2200, after Torsion had completed his evening review and was preparing for sleep. It was from Fleet Commander Yen, the Drathiki whose record Ochoa had broken. The message was 1 sentence, delivered in the clipped syntax the Drathiki used for statements of professional significance. "Tell the human I said well run." Torsion saved the message. He would deliver it in the morning. He did not sleep well, not because of anxiety or excitement, emotions the Kethrasi experienced differently than most species, processing them as structural tensions in the dorsal plate array rather than as chemical cascades in the brain. He didn't sleep well because he was thinking, and thinking kept his twin hearts in the elevated counterrhythm that prevented deep rest. He was thinking about ceilings. Every training doctrine in the Concord military system was built on the concept of species-specific performance ceilings. The entire structure of the Kethrasi Military Institute, the drills, the rankings, the progression tracks, the combat doctrine itself, assumed that each organism had a maximum output that could be identified, approached, and optimized but never exceeded. Training didn't make a Gorathi faster than its neural architecture allowed. It didn't give a Kalori bones that could withstand high gravity. It didn't grant a Vrelid the ability to split cognitive processing across parallel tasks. Training found the wall, and then it built a soldier who could operate at peak efficiency right up against that wall without breaking. But what did training look like for a species without a wall? The question kept him awake until 300. He got up, went to his console, and began redesigning the advanced conditioning program from scratch. At 600 the next morning, Ochoa reported to the advanced conditioning bay as ordered. The bay was smaller than the main sparring hall, purpose-built for individual and small group training with adaptive environmental controls. It was empty except for Torsion, who stood at the center console with his dorsal plates at neutral and his hands clasped behind his back. Ochoa entered, stopped at the regulation distance, and stood at rest. The hitch in her knee was almost invisible now. The osteobonding gel had done its work on the stress fractures, but Torsion knew from the medical report that the bone was still integrating. She was standing on repaired architecture. Most cadets would have requested the full 48-hour recovery window. She had requested none. Cadet Ochoa, before we begin, I have a message for you. Fleet Commander Yin, the Drathiki whose Stage 7 record you broke yesterday, asked me to relay the following. He paused, not for dramatic effect, because precision mattered. Tell the human I said well run. Ochoa's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of something that Torsion filed away for later analysis. It might have been surprise. It might have been the human equivalent of the Kethrasi structural tension he'd felt in his own dorsal plates the day before. Recognition from a source that mattered. Thank the commander for me, sir. I will. Torsion activated the console. The bay's environmental nodes powered up with a low hum that vibrated through the composite floor. Now, the standard advanced conditioning program is a 12-week escalation designed around species-specific stress models. I have discarded it for you. It does not apply. He turned to face her. His dorsal plates rose 1 degree, the instructional posture, the one that meant listen carefully and remember everything. Instead, I am building your program around a single principle. You do not have a performance ceiling. The sequence proved that. What you have are degradation thresholds, points where your efficiency drops, your accuracy falls, your speed decreases. You do not stop at those points. You continue past them. That is your species' advantage, and it is also your species' greatest vulnerability because you are capable of pushing past the point where continuing causes permanent damage. Your stress fractures were evidence of that. You ran on breaking bones because your body let you. A Goratha's body would have locked the affected joints to prevent further injury. A Kalori's pain response would have forced a collapse. Your body did neither. It let you choose, and you chose to continue. He watched her absorb that. No visible reaction, but her breathing had slowed by 2 cycles per minute, the pattern he was beginning to recognize as her processing state, the rhythm she fell into when she was encoding information into long-term storage. The purpose of this program is not to find your ceiling. You do not have one. The purpose is to teach you where your degradation thresholds are, how to recognize them in real time, and how to make informed decisions about when to push past them and when to stop. Because the galaxy will not always give you a safety pull. Out there, no chamber AI will catch you when your heart rate hits 191. You will need to know the difference between pain that means your body is working and pain that means your body is failing. Do you understand the distinction? Yes, sir. One is signal, the other is damage. Torsion's dorsal plates shifted, 1/2 degree. The micro-movement that meant that should not have happened, not because the answer was wrong. Because it was exactly right, delivered with the precision of someone who had already learned the lesson and was confirming she understood the vocabulary. He studied her for 3 seconds, 17 years old, 49 kilograms, from a city by the ocean on a planet most of the conquered had never heard of. Correct, we begin. The session lasted 90 minutes. Torsion ran her through a modified stress cascade, similar in structure to the sequence but paced differently, slower escalation, longer holds at each threshold, with rest intervals that forced recovery before the next load increase. The purpose was not endurance. It was calibration. He needed her to learn her own instrument, to know the exact reading on her body's gauges when efficiency dropped by 10%, 20, 30. She learned fast, faster than any cadet he had trained, not because she was smarter than a Drathiki or more physically gifted than a Gorathi, but because she listened to her body the way a pilot listened to an engine, attentively, without ego. When he told her that her left leg was compensating for the repaired fractures, and that the compensation pattern would cause a cascading alignment problem in her hip within 3 weeks if uncorrected, she adjusted her gait on the spot, rebalancing her stance with the same mechanical precision she'd used to redirect Brull's momentum on the sparring mat. She treated her own body the way she treated opponents, as a system with exploitable physics that could be understood, adjusted, and optimized. By the end of the session, Torsion had baseline data for 9 distinct degradation thresholds. He logged them, built the next session's parameters around the 2 weakest points, and dismissed her. She was at the door when he spoke again. "Cadet Ochoa." She stopped, turned, same neutral expression, same open hands. "The Conquered has 41 member species. Each has produced exceptional soldiers. The Gorathi breed warriors who can shatter reinforced plating with their bare hands. The Drathiki produce commanders whose tactical processing speed exceeds anything a human brain can match. The Pelori field scouts so fast that targeting systems cannot track them." He paused. His twin hearts were beating in the deep counter-rhythm again, the one reserved for absolute focus. None of them would have lasted 7 minutes in Stage 7, not because they lack courage or training, because their biology gives them a wall and when they hit it they stop. Their bodies make the decision for them. He held her gaze. "Your body does not make that decision. You do. That is not a gift, Cadet. It is a responsibility. Every time you choose to continue past a degradation threshold, you are spending resources that do not regenerate the way a Gorathi's bone density regenerates or a Pelori's fast-twitch fibers reset. You are mortal in a way that most species in the Conquered are not, because most species are stopped before they reach the point of permanent cost. You are not stopped. You pay the price and keep walking." He let the word settle. "Learn where the line is. Not so you can stop at it, so you know exactly what it costs when you cross it. That is the difference between a soldier who endures and a soldier who destroys herself." Dismissed. She held his gaze for 1 second longer than protocol required. Then she nodded, a movement so small it barely qualified as a gesture, and left the bay. Torsion stood alone in the advanced conditioning space for several minutes after she left. The environmental nodes hummed at standby. The console displayed her session data in clean rows. 9 degradation thresholds, mapped and measured, each one a point where any other species would stop, and this one simply chose not to. He thought about the 12-week training cycle ahead. He thought about the combat certifications at the end of it. He thought about what would happen when the other Conquered academies received his updated performance notes on Homo sapiens, and realized that the projection models they'd been using were not just inaccurate but fundamentally misconceived. He thought about Yen's message. "Well run." 2 words from a fleet commander who had once been the best the sequence had ever seen, sent to a 17-year-old who had tripled his record on her 8th day. Torsion returned to his console and opened the training calendar. 12 weeks, 37 cadets, 1 human who had broken something in his understanding of biology and replaced it with a question he couldn't answer yet. He began planning the next session. Morning drill continued. The instructor watched.